And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Carl Kurtz, who will introduce our speaker.
Morning, everyone. I am delighted to present and introduce, live from Washington, D.C., Dr. Norman Ornstein. I have been privileged to know, admire, and work with Norm for 50 years since we first met as Congressional Fellows of the American Political Science Association. A distinguished political scientist, Norm is one of the most sought after and quoted commentators on government and politics in America. Norm is a passionate advocate for our system of representative democracy. At the same time, he is a staunch critic of how it has been practiced over the last few decades. Just take a look at the titles of a couple of his recent books on the screen. Throughout his career, he has worked to improve our political system in areas like the continuity of government, campaign finance reform, and elections and voting. Most recently, he has been a member of the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, which has just issued a report recommending some noteworthy changes in America's civic life. In his prepared remarks, Norm will highlight some of the key problems confronting our political system and potential solutions to them. During the Q&A, feel free to ask him to amplify on those issues, but he'll also be glad to take your questions on American politics and the upcoming election. As always, post your questions in the chat window, and our team of question screeners will curate them and call on you to ask them. Norm, welcome to the Boulder Rotary Club.
Thanks so much, Carl. I'm delighted to join with everybody, and in part to celebrate the 50 years that I've known you and all of the terrific work that you did over that time with states, and to try and make this system work as well. So let me start with just a few preliminaries. One is that we obviously have additional stresses and strains that have come into play with the pandemic. Those are strains that are going to be felt across the world. We're going to see them for some time. There are strains both in the political system and in the society as a whole. They will bring enormous additional challenges to governance over the coming years that will go well beyond the period of what will happen when, Carl, are we, have you lost me?
No, you're good. I'm sorry.
The other extraneous noise, sorry. Anyhow, it'll bring a lot of additional strains to our governance for years to come. The economy is not going to be the same. And the areas in which we will need to restructure the economy, places where jobs are simply not going to come back, where we may see new opportunities. The fact that we are going to have quite remarkable debt that we will have to deal with over a long period of time, probably in a fashion greater than we saw in the aftermath of World War II. All of those things will require governance and decisions made by those in government that even in the best of times, even if we had, say, a political system functioning on all cylinders, would be a challenge, and we don't. And I'll come back to that in different ways. The second larger point that I want to make is that obviously we have seen quite remarkable challenges during the Trump years. Trump has brought with him a different kind of governance. Not only the way he governs, the people he's brought in with him, the realities that come with that, including the level of misinformation, disinformation, lying that is taking place inside government and outside, the foreign influence, the tribalism that we have in our politics that has gotten worse, the racial divide, the nativism, all of that. But the most important point to make here is that the conditions were there before Donald Trump, and many of them will be there after Donald Trump. Whatever happens in the coming election, if Donald Trump loses, we're going to have these challenges. We're going to have a political system that itself is stressed and has been distorted because of the dramatic changes that have taken place in our society from the time going back to the formation of the country. We have a political system that, as everybody knows, is a republic, but it's one that has tilted in a whole host of ways towards states, the Electoral College, the Senate, even the House of Representatives. And keep in mind that when the framers came up with the compromises that resulted in our constitutional setup, the ratio of population between the largest and smallest states was about 12 to 1, going to about 15 to 1. Now it's over 70 to 1. I will start by noting something that is a statistic I use now on a pretty regular basis. By 2040, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states. 50% of Americans will live in only 8 states. Think about what that means for the Electoral College, and think about what it means for the Senate. To start with the Senate, what that means is within 20 years, 30% of Americans will elect 70 of our senators. And that 30% represent states and population that in no way represent the diversity of the country, the economic dynamism of the country, and we're going to see challenges to legitimacy that will arise from that. In the 44 elections that took place from the first time we really counted popular votes, 1824, all the way up through 1996. We had arguably one election in which it was very clear that the winner of the popular vote did not win the presidency. Since then, we've had 2 out of 5, and we will have more going ahead. And, you know, the first time we had that happen in 2000, which of course was arguably the most controversial election in American history, 36 days to decide it, ultimately with a 5-4 vote of the Supreme Court. George W. Bush, the winner, lost the popular vote by 500,000 to Al Gore. But the reaction of most of the public was, you know, you have to operate by the rules. Somebody's got to decide. It's like a tennis match. It's not how many points you win or how many games you win. It's how many sets you win. And Gore's pretty gracious concession speech made us get through that fairly easily. The second time, where Donald Trump lost the popular vote by 3 million, not all Americans were as accepting of the legitimacy. And the next time it could be somebody winning and losing the popular vote by 5 or 6 million. So those are fundamental challenges to the legitimacy of our system. The House has its own levels of distortion, and all of that would be taking place, whatever had happened in 2016, and makes us focus on what we can do to begin to move back towards a system that's not a direct democracy necessarily, but one that is more responsive to the public as a whole. Of course, why are we seeing Americans move to those 15 states, not all of which are red states, and moving away from the smaller states, not all of which not all of which are blue states, the smaller states, not all of which are red. We have states like Delaware, for example. But basically, people move to places where the economy works in a global economy. And that means where we have cities, where we have an infrastructure, where we have the educational infrastructure, where we have the education and the supply chains working so that you can actually have a vibrant economy. The larger metropolitan areas in the country represent 2/3 of our GDP. And what that means is that in these smaller states, which have less education, more rural areas, less economic dynamism, we've seen this growing resentment. And there are more white populations who resent the growing diversity in the country. And all of that adds another layer of division that make it harder to operate in a democracy that requires debate, deliberation, and coming to some kind of broad consensus, at least. And of course, the advent of media, the sort we have, including social media, that make divisions easier to exploit and disinformation easier to put out there, also contribute to the kind of tribalism we've seen in our politics. It has gone well beyond the polarization, the ideological polarization we've seen in our parties, to something deeper and broader. So as Carl mentioned, I was a part of this commission that was created by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and we came up with a whole series of suggestions of things to do. Things that move us away from making it harder to vote to making it easier to vote, including a whole series of common sense reforms from same-day voter registration, automatic registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, but also moving Election Day to Veterans Day, making it a holiday without adding a new holiday, which has its own economic costs, but with a particular rationale, because of course we have fought and shed blood for the right of people to vote. And that would be a very positive thing to do. Having some forms of early voting, and of course, now the great controversies over the ways in which we're handling vote by mail, which has worked so well in Colorado, but which is now under challenge, and I'll come back to that also. We need to alter our campaign finance system to move away from the aftermath of Citizens United to giving empowerment to small donors and finding ways to disclose dark money as it now has come to dominate and distort our political process in ways that are very, very disturbing. We need to add seats to the House of Representatives. You know, I will not get into detail here, but the last time we added seats to the House was in 1910. And then Southern states that feared what would happen as more and more African Americans were joining the population made a bid to keep from extending the size of the House that would add power to states they didn't like. And eventually we capped it in 1929 at 435. But what was originally one representative for every 15,000 people now has some districts with more than 1 million people. And if we simply had the House of Representatives add seats so that the average size of a district was the same as the smallest state, now Wyoming, you could not only have more responsiveness, but you would alter the nature of the Electoral College to make it fairer. We should deal with the Senate first by adding some states that should be there, like DC and Puerto Rico. But because the Senate in the Constitution has a catch-22, Article 5 says you cannot alter the equal representation of the states. You need a whole new constitution. But there's a way around that as well, which it would require an amendment. But let's say we added 10 Senate seats added nationwide. We would then create a little bit more of an ability for the nation as a whole to be reflective of the population and the diversity in that Senate. So we have some creative ways in which we can deal with some of these issues. Now, I would add just one other element here in terms of the report that we had, although there are many other recommendations. But the Supreme Court and our federal courts have become tribalized and partisan in a fashion similar to what we've seen in our larger political process. And that's not a good thing. And the fact that we have a Supreme Court where justices increasingly are vetted to reflect a particular ideology, but where one president can go for a term without having a single vacancy, and another might have 3 or 4 because of the vagaries of the actuarial tables. We suggested that we move to single 18-year terms for justices on the Supreme Court, phased in and staggered so that in every presidential term, a president would have the ability to choose 2 Supreme Court justices, but also you'd have a wider pool, you'd have more of an incentive to pick people who might be, say, 60 or older, instead of what we now see, which is to try and get justices in their 40s so that they'll be there for decades after you no longer are in power as a president or a party. And it would lower the temperature a little bit if these are not decisions that are going to be affected for 30 or 40 years. Now, I would argue, and our commission argues, that you could do this by statute, not requiring a constitutional amendment, because the Constitution says that judges, members of the judicial branch, serve for life, serve at good behavior, but it doesn't say they necessarily have to serve on the same court. So you could move a justice after 18 years on the Supreme Court to an appeals court or to a senior status, and could still do this legislatively. Now, all of those things then could be accomplished for the most part legislatively. It will take a quite dramatic election to make them happen. We need to start thinking about ways in which we can alter the role of political money, alter the nature of our system so that representatives reflect more the nature of our country. And I would add, we also need to think through ways in which we can deal with the fact that a political system built on debate and deliberation, people from disparate areas coming together, sharing a common set of facts, and then working to solve problems, that we no longer have that common set of facts, and that a lot of people have a set of facts that are in fact false. And that means that solving problems like climate change, dealing with the racial issues, the issues of immigration and otherwise that plague our country, dealing with questions of criminal justice reform, become much, much harder to deal with at almost all levels. All of that we'll have to confront. Now, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about some of the other areas that I've been working on, some of which relate to COVID, although not entirely. Carl mentioned continuity of government. I helped to create a continuity of government commission in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. What would happen if our institutions were unable to function with a terrorist attack or another disruption? Our commission, which was co-chaired by the late Lloyd Cutler, a 2-time presidential counsel, and retired Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming, issued 3 reports on the Congress, the presidential succession, and the courts. Sadly, almost nothing was done. We're back having to deal with some of those issues, and we're going to reconstitute our commission. But one part of it is we've already seen that with COVID, it's entirely possible Congress will be out of session and that members won't be able to get back, particularly those from the Western states. We may not have air travel, or it might not be safe. And the House took at least some actions to be able to vote remotely and to have some debates remotely. They have instituted a process of proxy voting. The Senate's done nothing. If the pandemic gets worse in the fall, as it might well because of the flu season and the cold season, and because of our failure to respond in any fashion with a plan to deal with it, and let's say it's still in effect by January, if Congress can't get back, members can't be sworn in. There's nothing that enables them to be sworn in remotely. They have to be there. And then any of the issues that emerge from the election, which are supposed to be resolved beginning January 6th, we won't have a Congress to be able to deal with them. So those are issues that are very much on the table and need to be dealt with. Then we have the challenges of the election itself. Now, there's no question those challenges, some of them would be there just because of the pandemic and the inability of people to turn out in the way they normally have done in many states, most states, which is in person at the polls. We're going to have instances in states that have no real experience with voting by mail 5, 6, 7% of their voters having done this before, moving to 60 or 70%, and it could be many weeks before we get the results. That may come up against some deadlines that are in law. Not only do we have an election on November the 4th, November the 3rd, but the states are supposed to certify their electoral slates by this year, December 8th. And then the electors are supposed to meet to cast their votes on December 14th. They may not be ready by then. We may need to change the law to deal with those deadlines, which are supposed to be safe harbors. But now we also know that we're getting sabotage, direct sabotage of the Postal Service, that ways around that, as Colorado has had this experience of having the widespread use of drop boxes, so that people don't have to rely on the Postal Service to submit their absentee ballots. The Trump campaign is suing to keep the state of Pennsylvania from instituting drop boxes. Other states are trying to block them. The Ohio Secretary of State just this last week issued a ruling that is highly questionable given the law, that forbids local election officials from installing more than one drop box only at the Board of Elections. And so finding ways to enable people to vote safely and securely will be a challenge. It'll be a challenge because, as we saw, for example, in Georgia this time, the election administrators in Fulton County, the two top officials came down with COVID and they had no one running their primary election. And the vast majority of the poll workers, older people, did not show up. So we need to make sure we can get more poll workers, and we have to act against what is direct attempts by the President of the United States to undermine the election results and cast doubts on the legitimacy, as he did again today by suggesting that all the votes cast by mail are illegitimate because China, Russia, or North Korea could submit millions of ballots that would be invalid, and that is simply false. That is simply an impossibility. And of course, instances of voter fraud through votes by mail are almost non-existent. But the challenges to legitimacy, the ability to count the votes, the idea that we really need to have networks and others reporting on election results to make it very, very clear that the results coming in on election eve may have little to do with the actual results in the end, especially if the vast majority of ballots in many states are going to be cast by mail and won't be counted until well after the election. All of these are areas that I'm engaged in dealing with to try and make sure that even if we have some distortions in the system because our population has moved in dramatic fashion from what it was in colonial times, we still need to have an election where people are able to vote, where their votes are able to be counted, and where we all accept the legitimacy of the results. So those are just some of the challenges we face, and I'm very happy to move into your questions or comments and see if we can have a larger dialogue.
Thanks, Norm. We have a lot of questions coming up. I'm going to lead off with one, though, which is that it seems to, you said something about it would take a dramatic election to bring about some of the structural changes that you've talked about. What do you think the likelihood of such a dramatic election is, a real sea change in American politics?
If you're looking at it from today's perspective, and if we indeed do have a fair election, I think the odds are better than even that we will see a landslide. What we've seen happen is that Donald Trump's support has largely been stable. It's because we're in a tribal era. Somewhere around 42%, he could get up to 45%. At 45%, he could actually win in the Electoral College, and he did the last time. But we're seeing some erosion in his support in key areas. He is improving his standing with white working class voters around the country. the reason being that he has pursued an approach to the campaign and to governance that has been starkly racist in nature. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think there's much doubt about that. And that's improved his standing with one group of voters. But it's also hurt him. And we saw this in 2018 as well. The more divisive approach has hurt him with the more educated suburban voters, Republicans and independents, who have been turned off by some of that rhetoric and by the results. And we're now seeing some challenges to his support in rural areas where not only have they suffered economically before COVID and with it, but also as we've seen some expansion of COVID in those areas, they're ill-equipped to deal with it. So the ability of a Biden to win, not just in those battleground states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, enhanced by, I believe, what's likely to be a larger turnout of African Americans in places like Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Milwaukee because of the addition of Kamala Harris on the ticket. But we're also seeing real opportunities in places like Arizona and Florida. And Florida, of course, because the governor there, Ron DeSantis, following the lead of President Trump, the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, doing the same, has seen this huge outbreak in COVID and real disaffection by voters. And so there's a real chance of a landslide. What will also be required to make some of these other changes possible is a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic Senate probably by more than 1 or 2 votes. That's a tall order, but it's still potentially doable. And if those things happen, and the reason you're going to need more than a Senate of 51 Democrats or maybe even 52 is because at least a couple of those Democrats, starting with Joe Manchin, will not vote to alter the filibuster rule, which would be an absolute requirement if you're going to implement some of these democracy changes that I've talked about, or even do some of the things in other areas like climate change that would require legislative action in healthcare. There's a real chance of that happening, but we have to keep in mind that with the disruptions of COVID, with the challenges in the Postal Service, with what the president could do to bring out some of his supporters on election day, the fact that what existed for 20 years, a consent decree with the Republican Party not to send out people armed to intimidate voters, which had been happening before, that consent decree was removed for this election. And we might see disruptions at the polls as well, and real issues over whether we're going to count those votes. And who knows what will happen in the next 3 months that could bring voters back. We're in an unknown place, but there's a real chance that we could see the kind of landslide that I've described. And I would say if you talk to election officials of all stripes, Democrats, Republicans, most of whom want an election to work, a fair voting count, the mantra of election officials is, Lord, please let there be a landslide. They don't want any of the issues that emerge, ballots that don't get counted, ballots that are contested, to be on their shoulders, or an election in which poll workers don't show up unless we can get younger people to turn out. So we should hope that there's a landslide just for the good of the political system, whatever your partisan inclinations.
Thanks, Norm. Bill Anderson has a follow-up question relating to the Senate structure.
Thanks, Norm. Some of these ideas you're talking about are fascinating. As a political science nerd who lived in DC for a long time, I was always frustrated by the fact that we couldn't vote. And many have suggested that the reason DC and Puerto Rico haven't received the vote is because they will likely reliably vote blue. The idea of adding 10 senators is a fascinating idea, but I'm curious about your response on how support might likely break on partisan lines for that, and which states would add a senator, and what's the status of that proposal? Thanks.
So the latter proposal, the adding 10 states selected nationally, is not anywhere other than in my discussion with you, or more broadly, it'll take a lot. That would require a constitutional amendment. Down the road, it's possible that we'll get a public that understands that if we don't make some structural changes, we're going to potentially come apart at the seams. On adding DC and Puerto Rico as states, and interestingly, keep in mind that the non-voting representative for Puerto Rico in the Congress now is a Republican, and the governor of Puerto Rico elected is a Republican. Puerto Rico is not so reliably Democratic, although after the way it was dealt with during the hurricane season, that might change. But we know that Republicans have resisted adding either Puerto Rico or DC as states because they thought there would be Democrats elected. We actually had a proposal that had bipartisan support to add a House member for the District of Columbia by also adding a House member from Utah so that you wouldn't change the partisan balance, but that died in the Senate as well. Now, if you get 52 or 53 Democrats in the Senate, I think you will see an immediate move to add DC and Puerto Rico as states. And that requires referendums on the part of both of those areas. What they would have to do in the district is separate out a smaller area that would be the federal enclave, because that's in the Constitution. But the rest of DC that doesn't have that federal enclave, doesn't have the White House, the Congress, the courts, you can make a state. And I think if you're going to go for it, I would also add the U.S. Virgin Islands. These are all Americans, they're citizens, and they all deserve representation. Remember that when we added states back in the 19th century, a lot of that, including, by the way, dividing the Dakota Territory into two, into a North Dakota and a South Dakota, was done with the active connivance of southern states so that they could preserve their hegemony with white voters. Much of the action that we've seen in adding states in the past, just as we saw with capping the size of the House, had the racial element to it. That's the reality of American life going back to the founding. And it's probably time to make some changes, even if they would be viewed by Republicans as outrageous.
You're muted, Carl.
Sorry about that. Susan Connolly is next.
Thanks, Carl. Dr. Ornstein, what would happen if an incumbent president running for re-election loses in the Electoral College but refuses to accept that outcome and depart?
So we have a couple of scenarios here we have to worry about, and a number of us are spending a lot of time on those. One, which is a real possibility, is that some states do not accept the outcome of the popular vote in their states. So imagine, for example, that in Florida, with a Republican governor, Republican legislature, the results come in with all the votes by mail counted, and the Florida legislature, and the Constitution gives the states the ability to choose the electors, but all the states have passed laws saying that the popular vote will determine the outcome. You can imagine a scenario where the Florida legislature says one of two things. Either we don't believe those votes were valid, the president is right, they were corrupt, so we believe the winner of the popular vote is Donald Trump, and we're going to put forward that slate of electors. Or they would change their law in November, signed by the governor, to take back the power and put forward a separate slate of electors. We would then have on January 6th with the new Congress, something that's happened a couple of times in American history, which is contested slates of electors. And there the House and Senate have to agree on which slate of electors. That's one reason why the Senate becomes so important, because if the House and Senate don't agree, and there's some ambiguity in the law. It's the Electoral Count Act that goes back to 1887, enacted in the aftermath of the 1876 election, which was one of these highly controversial ones. It's not clear whether you would then say, well, Florida's votes are blocked because we don't agree. So that means the denominator of electoral votes has to change, and the winner is not 270, but half of the actual electoral votes that are counted. But if it's still considered to be 270, then we know under the Constitution, the House selects a president from the top electoral vote getters by state. And it means you need 26 votes. And there, right now, I believe there are 27 states that have Republican majorities in the state delegations because of the tilt towards the smaller rural states. And so some of these House races in the next, in November, become very, very important in terms of what the state delegations look like under that potential scenario. Now, if we get an election result that makes it very clear, and the Congress agrees, that the winner of the Electoral College is Joe Biden, and Donald Trump says, I'm refusing to leave, I'm not so concerned about that, because I believe that at noon on January 20th, when a new president is inaugurated and sworn in, and the Secret Service responsibility moves to that president, that the Secret Service would then get Donald Trump out of the White House. Although some might stick with him, and we could have a very messy situation. I will tell you, though, that one of the other challenges we have is that even if Trump loses and agrees that he's lost, you know that he will make the transition period from November through to January 20th be a disaster. He will do what he can to leave a scorched earth for his successor, not to make it easy for him to govern. And we're going to have to do everything that we can to make sure that we have a transition that works for the American people and that enables us to have smooth governance going forward. And for that, we're going to need to have Republicans, including elected Republicans, put country over party. And we just have to hope that that happens. And, you know, let's be blunt, we haven't seen much of that among the elected ones in Washington over the past 3.5 years.
Thanks, Norm. That's a remarkably nuanced answer that I expect Susan necessarily expect in such. That's terrific. So Chad Stam has a question now.
Hi, Norm. You kind of alluded to this at the end of your last answer, but I'm curious to know, in an era you mentioned of tribalism and personal sets of facts, are we beyond a point of no return? And if we're not, how do we move forward? And what are some of the things that organizations like Rotary can do to help move the country forward?
I'm glad you raised the last point, because I think we all need to, as individuals and in organizations that have credibility, stand up at this point. We need to help make sure the election works and is fair. We need to step up when misinformation or lies take place and call them out for what they are. And ideally, we can do it in a fashion that doesn't have, you know, the sort of both sides false equivalence emerge. As a more general matter, I'm afraid we are at a point, if not of no return, where we're going to have to struggle with these horrible issues for a very long period of time, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. I'm working with task forces and other organizations and talking to Google, Facebook, Apple News, Twitter, and others to try and make sure that during the election campaign, they are much more aggressive at weeding out disinformation, at pointing out what realities are, at giving people the right kind of information about our elections and steering them to the right places so that they know where to go to vote, where drop boxes are, for example, what it means when you get results on election eve. But we also know that places like Facebook have pretty traditionally put getting that extra ad dollar over finding ways to discourage misinformation. You know, I was particularly struck in the aftermath of the 2016 campaign when Facebook officials testified in the Senate. Then Senator Al Franken asked why they had openly taken ads from Russia. And the Facebook representative said, well, how are we to know that they were Russian? And Al pointed out that they'd been paid in rubles. That's a pretty clear indication of where they've come from. We have to hope that that will change. But we also know that developing algorithms to weed this stuff out is difficult. That if you channel different messages, and what the Russians did last time and they're doing this time, is trying to make appeals to the African American community to divide them from the rest of the community, and then making the exact opposite and more racist appeals to white audiences to try and foment division and even violence. And if you target ads in different ways, or even not just ads, but Twitter accounts, creating phony Facebook personages and then spreading them out there, that's hard to do. What we also know is that the technology has changed so that you can get videos that look absolutely real that are completely made up. And knowing truth from falsehood is going to become harder and harder. And the simple denial is not necessarily going to work. And with malign actors out there, and with those who find that they can make money in this fashion, and that includes Fox News, talk radio, and others. And it's not all on one side, although it's tilted very heavily in that direction up to now, that it's going to be very much harder to deal with the distortions. But what we also know is that you can create a set of presumed facts. You can take something and take a little shred that may be real and move it into something else, or you can create something out of whole cloth and have a lot of people who believe you. And QAnon is the best example of that. And the reality that QAnon, which of course first got some attention by promulgating this ridiculous falsehood that this pizza parlor in Washington had a child sex ring in its basement, and actually had a poor soul who believed it go there with weapons to try and free those kids. Now we're going to have at least one professed QAnon member in Congress from Georgia, elected as a Republican, highlighted in a tweet by Donald Trump saying she was going to be a big star, endorsed and supported by the Republican leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy. And unless and until we can get a mobilization to go against these conspiracy theories and entities that are going to push some of the most ugly and worst divisions in the country, we're going to have bigger challenges.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and go to John Sullivan with a question about the Electoral College.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ornstein. Do you recommend keeping the Electoral College? I have long thought that it doesn't work as it was intended anymore, and I think it should be abolished, and I'd be interested in your viewpoint on that.
So I would, for a long time, I was a supporter for one reason. And that reason was I feared an outcome that could be like 1960, where the popular vote was divided by less than 1/10%. And if it had been contested at that level, instead of down to a couple of states in the Electoral College, we could have had not just a nightmare like Florida in 2000, but multiplied by 50. that now is not an adequate reason. The distortions that are there in the Electoral College because of the tilt towards smaller and more rural states. The fact that we could have many more elections in which a majority of the popular vote, even a comfortable majority, does not result in the election of a president, means that we're going to have challenges to legitimacy. And I would also add that, you know, Republicans, or not just Republicans, people from smaller states who say we need the Electoral College because who will pay attention to us otherwise? So I saw this from the Senator Kramer from North Dakota. And my response to that was, one, tell me which presidential candidate in modern times has paid any attention to North Dakota. You've been a red state and they're not going to spend any time there. But the reality is that if there were a national popular vote where every vote counted, if it were going to be close, they would actually have more reason to pay attention to North Dakota or the issues of North Dakota. And the other drawback I would add to the Electoral College now, which I think is a very serious one, with so many states that are now pretty firmly red or blue, is a president has much less incentive to do the right thing for states from the opposite party. Just look, for example, at how Donald Trump has treated the fires in California. Now, as you face the potential for more fires, he gave it the back of his hand, and I can guarantee, and then you look at what he did with the hurricanes in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where he poured in resources. You don't want to have a situation where a president doesn't look at all Americans facing difficulties in the same way, but will have more incentives to give benefits to or deal with disasters of significant proportion to those states that are his supporters or the more contestable ones, and not to the states that are clearly going to vote for the other side. That's distorting what we have as our United States. And that's another very strong reason to move towards a different system. That different system can be the National Popular Vote Compact, where basically states agree, once you've gotten over the 270 at this point required to create a majority, that you will allocate your electoral votes based on the winner of the national popular vote. So you can do this without necessarily having a constitutional amendment, but we really need to deal with it.
So Norm, this has been a remarkable 45 minutes. Thank you very much for all these insights and ideas and challenges that you lay out for us. Let me turn now to Representative Jonathan Singer for a response on behalf of the club. And if Jonathan is not there.
Sorry, guys. Dr. Ornstein, Cassie's in the same room with me, and we had some feedback there. I'm so sorry. We wanted to thank you so much for your presentation today. It was very lively. Definitely gave us an awful lot to think about. And in your, one thing that you may know is that Rotary has been instrumental in eradicating eradicating polio since 1985. In 1985, there were over 320,000 cases, and now we're literally 10 or 20 cases. And so Rotary's had a big part of that. So in your name, we would love to donate 100 doses of the polio vaccine to the Polio Plus Challenge. Thank you very much, Dr. Ornstein.